Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's what you've been waiting for. I think this is part 9. I'm not sure, Ben. You can clarify with me. I'm pretty sure this is part 9 of mine and Ben's interview series that we've been doing throughout this entire process. What is going on? Jim Ratcliffe, Sheikh Jassim, are INEOS leading the race? Are the Qataris going to put in another bid this week? Why is Avram Glazer staying at a Sheikh Jassim owned hotel? These are all the questions that we're going to meet. Well, me and Ben are going to be discussing and what's going on, because remember, Ben, that the first deadline that we first heard was 31st of March, and we are now 6 weeks past that. United fans are starting to get a little bit tetchy because our summer is going to be directly impacted by this. But thank you very much, Ben, as always, for joining me today to hopefully offer some clarity on this situation.
I'll do my best. First of all, we need clarity on what a 9-part series is actually termed.
New word. There is no word for it now. We're coining a new. We can call it whatever you want.
My Latin extended to about 5, and then once we got into 6, 7, 8, and now 9, I have no idea.
I've got no idea either.
But if anyone knows that, let us know.
I'm sure somebody will know. But to summarize everything that's sort of happened in that, as we know, in the last 4 or 5 days, it was around about Friday where the stories came out. I think it was from Matt Dickinson from the Times that INEOS were the heavy favourites. INEOS were going to go forward and be the preferred bidders for the takeover of Manchester United. The response from the Qatari side with Mike Keegan was that, hold on, there's going to be another Qatari bid, might be an 11th hour bid, and therefore we were just thrown back into more jeopardy, if you want to call it that. More conflicting reports, I think, would be a more accurate way to describe it. And then this week, Avram Glazer's been spotted at, as I said, a Sheikh Jassim owned hotel in London. Ben, what have you been hearing throughout this whole process? We spoke over the weekend. We didn't get a chance to have an interview, but what actually happened with this this story from, I think last week was when I believe it started with Martin Lipton in the Sun, and I sort of dismissed it because it was just, well, Martin Lipton's not really been involved in this process to date. He was saying that it was going to be Ratcliffe as a preferred partner. Then you heard murmurings from the Nice press down in the south of France saying the same thing, but you kind of would expect it given the region. And then, of course, Matt Dickinson followed. And what have you been hearing or been speaking to with the parties in terms of INEOS being the preferred bidder? Is that what's being told? Is that what the Raine Group is saying?
Well, I think the first thing to say is there's multiple parties involved, and it's very important in reporting to go to all sides. And in essence, you get in a takeover before a preferred bidder or a period of exclusivity, competitive tension. And we've seen this throughout the entire process. So at the time we're recording, which is early on Tuesday morning, there has been no formal indication to either group that they are the preferred bidder. And that's important because it tells you that they're both still in the race, as are the strategic partners or minority investors. The Glazers haven't yet shown their hand. And the next step is key, because either both groups are going to be kept in the race to create competitive tension and try and drive up the price, or one group is going to be picked, and then the situation will become a lot clearer. And part of the reason for the confusion is down to either, one, the Glazers haven't got the right club valuation from either of the two groups, looking for either an outright sale or control, or they know in what direction they want to go, and the other group is effectively a stalking horse. And the amount of times that I've heard that phrase from sources to indicate that due to the lack of volume of suitors, competitive tension can only really be built by pitting groups against each other. And even though now the two bids structurally are very different, and one effectively allows Joel and Avram Glazer to stay, that is Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and the other, of course, is for 100% of the club. So not just the 69% that the Glazers own, but the entire club. That said, there is still a way of making them effectively fight against each other to try and drive up the price. And as we discussed last time, a final offer is only really accurate in the sense of it's a formal deadline. But because Manchester United is a publicly listed company, and due to the fact that no one's in a period of exclusivity from here, and as with any takeover, there's always haggling over price. And that's exactly what's happening at this stage. So then if we flash back to what happened over the course of the last few days, from Sir Jim Ratcliffe's perspective, he's stringently following the process. And the reason for that is because when he bid for Chelsea, he went outside of the Raine Group process with an 11th hour bid, ironically, when Clearlake Bowley were already in an exclusive period. And it didn't go down well because he announced publicly that he wanted to buy Chelsea, that he had the money, and ultimately he wasn't part of the process. And Clearlake Bowley were already in that exclusive period and only about 2 weeks away from acquiring the club. So Ratcliffe now is making sure he follows the process, which means that his engagement is with Raine Group and there's cautious optimism and the mood is positive. And it's obvious that despite all the permutations in the games, if Joel and Avram Glazer genuinely want to stay, then Ratcliffe or a minority investor or financer is the only option. So if they're going to go down this route of a laddered exit, which is something even from my first appearance on this show, I was talking about, if they're going to go down the route of 4 selling now and 2 remaining, but maybe with an exit path over the course of the next 2 to 4 years, then Ratcliffe is the only option because Sheikh Jassim is an all or nothing offer. It's 100% or the 9-2 Foundation walk away. And this is what's always given Ratcliffe confidence, because the feeling is that if the structure is different to Jassim, so they're not head to head, and the Glazers, 2 of them anyway, are given the opportunity to stay, then suddenly it is an appealing offer that satisfies 6 siblings that have not necessarily been unified throughout this process. But from Jassim's point of view, there is still a feeling that the race is open. And the reason for that is because until anyone is in an exclusive period, there becomes a situation whereby money may talk. And in essence, if this is not about 2 Glazers staying, but it's just about hitting a valuation that satisfies 6, that is where the 9-2 Foundation feel like there is a deal to be had. And all 6 of the Glazers, not just 4 of them, remain determined sellers. And because the Glazers haven't shown their hand, it's very difficult at this point to really sense the direction of travel, because make no mistake, Raine Group are still speaking to both groups. So with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, the offer is clear and flexible. And at this stage, they're not into a final negotiation. It's a case of questions on technical points off the back of the final offer. And with Jassim, the feeling still remains that the offer would need to be increased to stand a chance, but they're not yet out of the race. And if this offer that has been tabled is as bad or low as some sources have indicated, then of course Raine Group and the Glazers could have kicked out 9-2 Foundation from the race and said, we're moving ahead with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, or we don't like either, so it's a no sale. And then they'd be exploring strategic partners or minority investors. They haven't done that at this point, which means that the race is open, but it needs to now move quickly over the course of the next hours. Otherwise, both groups are going to start to get agitated, much like Manchester United fans, because they know that if the picture isn't clear when the transfer window opens, it's going to overshadow the summer.
Yeah, I think the word race, I'm not sure we can use, I mean, it might be like one of those like long walking races you get in the Olympics. I don't really think you can call it a race anymore. It's just, it's been, what's obvious to me is that the Glazers still at this point don't have exactly what they want. Otherwise, it would have been done and dusted. I think something that I've raised and questioned is, you know, one thing we've heard about the Qatari bid the whole way through, obviously they have the deeper pockets. Obviously they can, if they want to, buy Manchester United. How important is getting United for the right price compared to getting United for the heritage of then being the owners of still one of the 3 biggest clubs in the world? That does come with the premium that the Glazers are clearly arguing, is that if the Qataris really want the club, what are they waiting for?
Well, it's a good question. I think just coming back to the race aspect, we can call it a race because people look at this in transfer terms and maybe wrongly presume the deadlines are hard when they're softer. So takeovers, as I've said many times, are like having a baby. They take 9 months. Traditionally, if you're a Newcastle fan, they take 18 months. So this is moving fast by a takeover standard, but it's moving slow by a fan perspective, because obviously many Manchester United fans want clarity, want the Glazers out, and that can't come soon enough. But if you actually look at the mechanism of what effectively a likely world record sale is going to entail and how long this type of business transaction should take, it's important to point out that we're only about 6 months in from start of process through to now, and that by any takeover standards would be lightning speed. Not quite as quick as Chelsea, but that was obviously under more urgent circumstances due to the fact that Roman Abramovich was forced out due to sanctions. So that's just one thing to point out. The second thing is fans may feel things are not moving because they're waiting for a preferred bidder. But this whole process is a bit transactionally backwards. So on the one hand, there's no preferred bidder. That would be atypical given how advanced we are after final offers. But from a logistical point of view and due diligence perspective, a lot from the groups has been done, which means when or if a preferred bidder is named, whether that's this week or beyond, a lot of what's necessary to then move thereafter is already completed. So it's almost like two groups have been asked to jump through logistical hoops earlier, and usually some of the things that they would do would be reserved for after a preferred bidder has been named in a longer period of exclusivity. And yet those tasks have been completed. So if the Glazers green light a group, then a deal will be a lot closer from a logistical and due diligence point of view, even though it appears behind. So the extra step, third or final bids, at least in a formal sense, felt like it was adding time, but not necessarily, because during that period, a lot of what usually only a singular group would do, multiple groups have been done. And that is very important to stress. But things do still have to move in order to get things done now before the transfer window opens. But don't be surprised if a preferred bidder is named, if things then move in super speed. So that is a really key point. And then coming back to 9-2 Foundation and your other question, which I think is really key, a lot just depends on whether 9-2 Foundation are who they say they are. So everybody is presuming they're rich. And why? Because it's a Qatar bid. And that's so superficial. And my understanding remains that the Emir has backed this and is aware of everything that's going on. And also that key Qatari stakeholders like Nasser Al Khalifi were involved in the consultation process. So we have to separate where we are now from all that came before, because there's two parts to the bid. One is internally within Qatar, determining whether to bid and how to bid and how much to bid for. And then the second part is obviously the 9-2 Foundation and who they are, both practically and legally, and then their dealings with Raine Group and anybody connected to the Glazers and the selling side. And at that point, some of the government or senior Qatari officials move away because they're not necessarily all the funders. Some of them are just consultants. You're not going to do a deal in Qatar and not involve Nasser Al Khalifi. But it remains to be seen whether he would eventually move across to Manchester United or remain with QSI and PSG. And we have to understand whether the UEFA rules are going to relax to allow Manchester United and PSG to coexist, whereas now there's far more question marks. So I have no doubt that there is government support and involvement, but the exact source of the funding behind the 9-2 Foundation still remains a little bit of a mystery. And the reason for that is because the tactic, which is normal, by the way, for this type of takeover, when you create a relatively new vehicle. I know that technically it was registered in 2021, but for this purpose, it's effectively an empty vessel. And therefore, the strategy is to negotiate and win and then fund. And that doesn't just mean transferring 5 or 6 billion into an account that is currently near empty minus whatever proof of funds is necessary. It also basically means determining how exactly you're going to pull that funding together. And quite clearly, the group have got an idea, but we need to understand that better. Because I can tell you that throughout this process, you've had Nasser Al Khalifi involved in a consultancy capacity, particularly when they were determining how to bid. Then you have Sheikh Jassim, who is the sort of leading face behind it, and he is wealthy and a private individual. So a lot of it may well be, as has been stated, his money. But then we know that in the Articles of Association behind the 9-2 Foundation, there is this illusion historically, using quite generic business terms over in Qatar, to state funding. And to be perfectly honest with you, the Glazers do not care if this is state funding. And there's nothing in the rules with state funding, but it's about declaring the right people. It's about understanding who has ultimate control over the club. And then if those from the state may fail the Premier League owners and directors test, that's when you have far more of a problem. But in essence, the question over if there was state funding would more be one of trust, because this has been billed as a bid for Manchester United from a private individual. So if you want to accept that at face value, you actually can't make the argument that Qatar just have more money than Ratcliffe, because we don't have that understanding over Sheikh Jassim and his wealth. But if we're going to go down the other line, that there's quite clearly state involvement and funding can be found, then obviously if they want to find more money, they can. And this, I think, is where a few things come into the mix to answer your question. One is, what was the impact of the Credit Suisse collapse?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Specifically to this group, and that may be one factor. Two is how badly the state wants it, because if they're unsuccessful and they've distanced themselves from it, they can basically walk away and then have a scenario where QSI or another entity comes back for another club in the future. So there's a purposeful distancing between state and 9-2 Foundation, which allows them to be a part of this if a deal is agreed, but also walk away from this if they choose to go in another direction. And that is just basic business practice. And having lived out in Qatar for 5 years, I've seen it many times where the state may be backing it. The state may ultimately be funding it at the end of the day. But if they're not successful, the state had nothing to do with it. And then it allows them to move on somewhere else. So this is part of the complexity. And what's frustrated Raine Group, as per my understanding, is that they've never got a clear picture. It's all back channeling. It's all intermediaries. It's different people each time. And that's been a problem in the relationship between 9-2 Foundation and Raine Group, because many times throughout this process, as I understand it, the Glazers have thought, who are these people and are they even credible? Because their level of financing is based upon trust. Their entity is not ready to complete a deal. Sheikh Jassim is not coming to Manchester or being part of the conversations directly. He's been using Ferry Bacchus, who is his personal advisor, and a range of other bankers. I have been told that a series of slightly random figures have been involved in the conversations as well, including one former member of the US government. So when you add all of that up, although it's not atypical to use intermediaries, it's not only the Glazers that have to show their hand, it's also the 9-2 Foundation. I don't mean that in a critical way, because this is a world record transaction. It's complicated. Certain people in Qatar are obviously on different time zones, but there has to come a point where if 9-2 Foundation are going to win, they and the Glazers show their hand, and all the back channeling and all the intermediaries disappears. And eventually, either via Raine or directly, but with Raine's blessing quite clearly because there's a process, direct talks are going to have to take place. And if 9-2 Foundation don't start using a clear point of contact and have more transparency over who they are, how they're going to fund this vehicle, and how they're going to satisfy the process, they will not win. But if they come back in with an 11th hour offer that is competitive, and the games and the politics and the smoke screens on both sides are dropped, they still do stand a chance. And I think the last thing I would say is that even if there is a preferred bidder, keep an eye out on for if that preferred bidder is in an exclusive period. Because whereas previously we'd said an exclusive period may not be necessary due to the fact that a lot of the parts for a deal are close, and that's true. And that's beneficial if something gets signed quickly. But if it drags on and there's no exclusive period, then it tells the group that is not the preferred bidder that they still have a window of opportunity to move. So it becomes competitive tension. It becomes still an open race. It becomes a possibility whereby perhaps money still talks. So I think that when we get to the next step of this process, which should in theory be the Glazers showing their hand, it's going to be about, one, has a deal basically been done secretively, and by the time a preferred bidder is announced, everything's kind of in place, and then the race is over? Or are they going to sort of limp towards indicating who they want to work with? And then the next question is, was that a move to still invite another group, which is where we're at now, to respond? Or will they actually back whatever decision they make with an exclusive period, which at least tells you that that is genuinely the direction you want to go in?
I think you're saying that the logic of this being transactionally backwards there is that once we get past this point, there should be something that speeds up. But surely that's wrong when you take into account, if hypothetically, of course, this goes towards INEOS, because the structure of that, the Sheikh Jassim bid is very straightforward. I'm buying all your shares, off you pop, easy. The INEOS and the Jim Ratcliffe one, buying 4 of them, keeping 2 in, that doesn't really match with the share structure that currently exists. What about the controlling stake? There's so many more complicated things surrounding an INEOS bid in the takeover than there is with a Jassim bid. So surely there's going to be difference in the timelines depending on which one goes forward.
To an extent, but again, you're working on the assumption that somehow they decide to go with Ratcliffe without really knowing what they're walking into, and then a complex negotiation over a new structure needs to take place. So what I'm saying is that because it's a bit transactionally backwards, there's a very strong chance with Ratcliffe that all parties are well aware of the structure and are happy with how that looks, which means that if they proceed to preferred bidder status, the type of negotiations that are necessary would be more about the exit terms on the 20% for Joel and Avram than necessarily around power or control. So it wouldn't surprise me if Ratcliffe goes down the line of buying 50% for about 2.5 billion and Joel and Avram stay, if any conversations thereafter are more about that laddered exit and when it comes and how it comes and who's got the control over activating that and ultimately at what number, as opposed to saying, should I take 50? Should I take 51? Should I take 60? Should I take 69? Is there any possibility that 2 Glazers could stay and still have some kind of short-term power? Is there any laddered opportunity for Ratcliffe to come in with a large amount of shares but no power, but then when the Glazers exit in 2 to 4 years, gain all of the control? I don't think any of that's on the table. Ratcliffe wants control right now. It's non-negotiable, which means that if the Glazers pick that, they know that structurally they'll lose their Class B voting power. And again, a lot of that, as I understand it, will have been specified. And although Ratcliffe is flexible, he's saying, I can take the 69, I can take 50. One thing that he's adamant on is, if you stay, I have the control. So this isn't about working within any current structure. It's about removing that Class B voting power and giving Sir Jim Ratcliffe the control. And if the Glazers pick him, they'll know that and they'll have to accept that, or the 2 that want to remain will have to go in a different direction. So what I'm saying is that because talks are taking place in a transactionally backwards way, whereby both groups in many ways are doing things that you'd normally only do in an exclusive period, and therefore, if the Glazers are genuinely happy with something, a deal will be available to sign a little bit sooner, because concurrent to any negotiation around final offers, this legwork in other areas has been done. But the flip side of that is, if they're not happy with the number and they still don't put someone in an exclusive period, then preferred bidder doesn't really mean a great deal, because you're saying, this is the preferred bidder, but I'm not going to put you in an exclusive period because actually we're not there on the number. And then suddenly the group that isn't the preferred bidder can just say, well, the door's still open. So this is why I'm explaining both sides. You can construe a preferred bidder with an exclusive period as allowing things to move fast. You can also construe a deal just being done and then effectively announced. And then you also don't need the long exclusive period because that legwork's been done. But that third option is still, they may name a preferred bidder, and then if there is no period of exclusivity, the other group still has that window of opportunity to pounce, which means that's where you started.
What's the Raine Group stance been on this? I remember me and you we've spoken about this for like last few weeks behind the scenes, and sort of like everyone's sort of kind of getting frustrated with each other. There's a lot of finger pointing going on behind the scenes without really saying too much. The Raine Group they obviously led the Chelsea takeover, and that's why the Glazers went with them. Are they still leading this process? Are they still sort of content with the timeline of it all, or is it? Are they getting equally as pissed off with everything that's sort of not happening?
Well, I think just to finish on Jassim quickly, the timescale of acquisition, even though it is a cleaner transaction, as you say, has its own complications because remember, it's 100% of the club. So 69% of the Glazers, and then still that delisting of the public shares, which people may see as a formality. And if the price is good enough for the Glazers, it is likely that it will also be good enough for the other minority shareholders. But just one thing I'd point out is that it will take time, even if it's deemed to be a formality, to get to 100%. So the race is on. But you're absolutely right. It's a cleaner transaction because all of the Glazers go. But it might actually be a slower transaction because of the need to then go and get the other shares to move to 100%. And then with Raine Group, I think there's a few things. One, they get a bad rap sometimes because, as I said earlier in the show, this is a very fast process by takeover standards. Second thing is that the deadlines were always going to be soft and fluid. And then Raine's role has really been twofold. First of all, to find the suitors and separate credible from non-credible, and all that's passed. And now to deal with them, to get a deal to the point of close to signing. So when the Glazers make a decision, there's less work to do. And they've carried out that job effectively. But I think that a bit like a job interview, although it's a very superficial comparison, Raine would be HR and the Glazers are your hiring manager. And as a consequence, there's only so far Raine can take things. And then it's up to the family themselves to actually show their hand. And the reason why I say it's superficial is because Raine are not only HR, they're highly respected, they're experienced, their input is vital in many ways because they understand the financial market. And as a consequence, if you're asking for anyone at Raine's advice, it is going to carry weight. But they are not the decision makers. They are the facilitators. And as a consequence, if the Glazers kick their heels, if the Glazers want competitive tension, if the Glazers are asking those handling the sale to do more, whether that's extra steps or whether that's meetings or whether that's ultimately trying to move things in a different direction, Raine are employed on behalf of the Glazers. So even if Raine met the Glazers and said, this is the offer we think you should accept, if there's no family unity, there's not much that Raine can really do. And I think that they've handled it really well. And I know that others may be frustrated, and it's really easy to point fingers at the people creating the deadlines. And also, it's very easy to point fingers because the groups are frustrated. And who are they frustrated with? Raine. And certain sources may brief that. But there's two sides to every story. And I empathize with the groups for sure, because if you bid this kind of money, you want a response, you want clarity, you want feedback, you want to know where you stand. You want as many direct conversations as you can. And that's normal. But Raine are obviously having to deal with both sides. And if the Glazers are dragging their feet, if the Glazers are not unified, if the Glazers want competitive tension, there's only so much that Raine can say and do. And I've always understood that a lot of these deadlines that people think have been pushed because they had Easter in mind have been relatively fixed. So the Raine perspective from those around the selling side that I'm speaking to is very much that things are largely on track based upon the original timescale estimations. And now the thing that's going to push it away from being on track is basically, once again, the Glazers either not having family unity or not getting the price that they want. And that's not really down to Raine handling anything poorly. They can only have dialogue with both sides to try and get them to the same place. And if they're not there yet, there's not much more that Raine can do, except, if necessary, facilitate talks, whether direct or through Raine, and get to a point where eventually there is an approach.
Well,
and if we're going to be critical, sorry, Sam,
that's right.
Critical, I think that it's easy to bash either Raine or a group and say, well, why is Jassim not bidding higher? Or why is Ratcliffe suddenly being more flexible on structure? Or why are Raine not feeding back? It's really easy to do all of that. But I come back to what I've said before. The only people that can get this done are 6 unified siblings. So if we are to discuss why it hasn't been done yet, I think we have to come back to that point.
Well, I think we, as United fans, having had the Glazers as owners for 18 years, I think we understand how crap they are with communication, how split they can be with decisions, how they can make the simplest logical decision somehow drag out over an extended period of time, let alone when they're actually selling the club, let alone when they've actually got this huge decision, which is the ultimate decision. So I can understand that at the core of all these delays, of course, it's the Glazers. Of course it is. I know that. Speaking of the Glazers, this week, Avram Glazer was at Wembley for the Women's FA Cup final. He was there for the men's team in the League Cup final. He was pictured walking out of a hotel owned by Sheikh Jassim's father, because there's a lot of Qatari property, well, a lot of London property owned by Qatari individuals. Is that something that we should be looking into? Is it a sign, Ben, or is it nothing more than that?
It's a total red herring. And if you were to hold a direct meeting with representatives from the 9-2 Foundation, then you're not going to do it in Claridge's or any other HBJ-owned hotel. It's simply not how a meeting of that importance would take place. And I think if you look at the Glazers and when they've come over to England, these type of hotels are where they stay or visit, and that's just normal. So people will read a lot into it, but I'm told, even from sources on the Qatar side, and you would expect them to fuel it if it was something significant, that where Avram Glazer was pictured was a total red herring. That said,
it's a bit silly, isn't it? Really, like walking into a hotel. If it is a total red herring and he's just accidentally booked himself into a hotel that's owned by the father of somebody who's trying to buy Manchester United, it's like, do you research?
I think it's more just that this type of person ultimately frequents that type of hotel, and HBJ owns lots of property, and also HBJ is not involved anyway in his son's bid. But in essence, these are the type of hotels where ultimately Avram Glazer takes meetings. And it may have been foolish, even if there was an unrelated meeting, to go in there knowing he might be followed and photographed. But as I've said many times, the core meetings taking place are not going to be in that type of environment. You really think that Sheikh Jassim or his advisors and Avram Glazer would say, hey, let's just thrash out a deal over a coffee on the ground floor in the lobby of Claridge's?
Somebody make a move. That's all we need now. But let's sort of nip it in the bud there, because we need to just somebody make a damn move. Whether it's the Glazers, whether it's Jay, just stop it. Just make a move. I think that's what I would say. I'm just. I know you're not doing anything wrong. I know we're just reporting what we can report, but just make a fucking move. That's what I want. That's what I want to see. The next time we talk, enough of this smoke
But
and mirrors.
by the way, behind the scenes, and this is part of the intrigue of it all, that phrase you just used, I won't swear, but make a move. The Glazers are saying to the groups, just make a move. The groups are saying to Raine, just make a move. Raine are saying to the Glazers, just make a move and indicate what you want to do. The Glazers are saying to Raine, go back to the groups and get them to make a move. The groups are saying to the Glazers, just make a move. So this, unfortunately, is not on one person. I think the Glazers will show their hand at the right valuation or structure. I think that Raine can't make a move without the Glazers. I think the groups don't want to make a move because they want to stick to their valuations, but the 9-2 Foundation will have to stand a realistic chance. So we can't pin it only on one group or organization or member of the Glazer family. And I know that's really frustrating, but again, this is takeover one-on-one. This is no surprise to the groups. It's no surprise to Raine, in my opinion. It's no surprise to the Glazers, but it's incredibly infuriating to the fan base. So I agree with what you said. And that is what will ultimately happen now over the coming days. And when we get that group, we can turn our attention to talking about things that are probably more exciting to the fan base, which is not who the group is, but what are they going to do at the football club.
Exactly. That's the conversation I want to have. But look, as I said, part 10, let's hope that these moves have been made and we don't need to beat around the bush anymore, because I'm bored of it. You're bored of it. I'm sure everyone else is bored of it. Ben, as always, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the Champions League tonight. And as I said, next time we chat, I hope it's a little bit less frustrating and just more clarity.
Look forward to it. All the best, everyone.